A millionaire forced his son to marry a humble farmer to teach him a lesson. On the wedding day, the millionaire trembled at what the farmer asked in exchange. Before starting the video, tell me where you are watching this video and what time it is. Henry Sinclair was a man born into opulence, with a silver spoon that gleamed brighter than most could dream. At just 28, he embodied privilege. Sleek suits tailored to perfection, a fleet of luxury cars, and a disdainful air that could cut through steel. The city knew him well, not as a philanthropist or a kind soul, but as an emblem of extravagance and entitlement. Henry walked through his life as if the world owed him reverence. Waitstaff quaked under his glare when a dish wasn't to his liking. He scoffed at charity fundraisers, calling them vanity projects for the desperate. The working class, to him, were no more than cogs in a machine designed to sustain his comfort. At a grand gala, when asked about his goals for the year, he smirked. Goals? I already have it all. His laughter, loud and empty, echoed in the room, leaving even the wealthiest uneasy. This was Henry, confident in his riches but hollow in character. What he didn't know was that the stage was being set for a humbling far greater than his imagination. In a quaint countryside valley miles away from Henry's bustling city, Clara Bellamy lived a life defined by simplicity and perseverance. With calloused hands and sun-kissed skin, she worked tirelessly on her family's modest farm. Her days began before sunrise, tending to crops, feeding livestock, and managing the household. Despite her aching muscles, Clara's spirit never wavered. Her parents, aging but resilient, depended on her entirely. Medical bills loomed over them like dark clouds, yet Clara pressed on, her determination shining as brightly as the morning sun. Beyond her family, she found time for her community. She often shared surplus crops with struggling neighbors and hosted free workshops on sustainable farming for local kids. Though her clothes were patched and her boots worn, Clara carried herself with grace and quiet dignity. While her farm's financial stability was fragile, her heart was unshakable. As she walked through the village market, her warm smile greeted everyone. But even her kindness would soon clash with a force that couldn't yet see the value of her unyielding resolve. The market was bustling, vibrant with scents of fresh produce and chatter. Clara arranged her homegrown vegetables on the stall, her usual smile in place. It was there, amidst the laughter and bargaining, that Henry strolled by, disinterested and dismissive. $3 for this. Are you joking? He sneered, picking up a ripe tomato from Clara's stand. His tone dripped with disdain. I've seen better in a grocery store. This is barely worth $1. Clara's smile faded, but her voice was steady. It's locally grown, sir. Fresh and organic. Henry scoffed, tossing the tomato back onto the pile with an exaggerated grimace. Organic. Another word for overpriced. His mocking laugh drew attention, leaving Clara's cheeks flushed, not with embarrassment but with suppressed frustration. Nearby, Charles Sinclair watched the exchange silently. A man of immense wealth himself, Charles had grown his empire from nothing. He had always been troubled by his son's lack of respect for those who worked hard for their livelihoods. This display of arrogance was the final straw. As Henry strutted away, Charles approached Clara. "Miss," he said gently, "I may need your help in teaching my son a much-needed lesson." Charles Sinclair summoned Henry to his study the following evening, his tone measured but firm. Henry strolled in nonchalantly, expecting yet another discussion about investments or acquisitions. Instead, he was met with a thunderbolt. "You're to marry Clara Bellamy," Charles declared, leaning back in his chair. Henry froze mid-stride. "Excuse me. Marry who?" His laugh was sharp and incredulous. "The farmer girl. Is this some sort of twisted joke?" Charles's gaze was unyielding. "No joke. Marry her, or you lose your inheritance. Every cent." The air grew tense, Henry's disbelief palpable. "You can't be serious," he spat, pacing like a caged lion. "Why would I marry some dirt-covered stranger? I don't even know her." Charles's voice remained calm. "Because it's time you learn the value of hard work and respect. Clara represents everything you lack: integrity, resilience, and compassion. This is non-negotiable." Henry's face burned with indignation, his fists clenching. "You'd throw me away for some peasant," he hissed. "I'd do anything," Charles replied, his voice steely, "to save you from becoming a man unworthy of this family's name." Charles arrived at Clara's farmhouse the next morning. Clara greeted him cautiously, her hands still damp from milking the cows. The proposition he laid out stunned her. "You want me to marry your son?" Clara's eyes narrowed, her voice laced with disbelief. "Why on earth would I agree to that?" Charles sighed, choosing his words carefully. "I understand how this must sound, but you've seen Henry. He needs a wake-up call, and I believe you're the one who can teach him." Clara straightened her shoulders. "I'm not a tool for your son's education, Mr. Sinclair. I have a family to care for and a community to serve." Charles nodded gravely. "I thought you might say that. Which is why I'm offering to clear your debts, secure your farm, and invest in your community. Your neighbors need you, and this could be your way to help them all." Clara hesitated, her principles clashing with practicality. The weight of her responsibilities pressed on her chest. After a long silence, she said softly, "I'll do it, but not for him. For my people." Charles nodded, respect gleaming in his eyes. "For them, then." When Henry learned Clara had accepted, his anger turned to bitter resentment. "So, she's just in it for the money," he muttered to himself, pacing his penthouse. The idea of marrying someone he deemed beneath him felt like an insult, but the alternative, losing his inheritance, was unthinkable. The days leading up to the wedding were fraught with tension. Henry made no secret of his disdain for Clara's humble ways. When they met to discuss the arrangements, his tone was cold. "Let's make one thing clear. This is a transaction. Don't expect anything more." Clara's reply was calm but cutting. "I wouldn't dream of it." Her quiet strength grated on him, forcing him to confront his insecurities. Despite his arrogance, part of him felt unnerved by her poise. As the wedding day approached, Henry found himself haunted by his father's words. Deep down, he wondered, had he truly lost his way so much that a woman like Clara was needed to remind him of his humanity? The morning of the wedding dawned crisp and clear, with the estate's grand hall decorated in opulent splendor. Crystal chandeliers sparkled, and the air was filled with the scent of roses and expensive perfume. Guests in designer attire mingled, their conversations laced with curiosity and judgment about the unconventional union. When Clara arrived, a hush fell over the crowd. Instead of a designer gown, she wore her everyday farming clothes: a simple cotton dress, sturdy boots, and her hair tied back in a plain braid. Her presence was a stark contrast to the extravagance surrounding her. Henry's face turned crimson as murmurs rippled through the guests. "What is she wearing?" someone whispered. Clara, unfazed by the scrutiny, walked down the aisle with her head held high. Her simple attire wasn't an oversight, it was a statement. She wasn't here to impress, she was here to be herself. As she reached the altar, she caught Henry's eye. He looked away, his embarrassment palpable. But Clara's gaze was steady. She was here on her terms, and nothing, not even Henry's disdain, would shake her resolve. The officiant began the ceremony, his voice reverent, but when he reached the traditional vow exchange, Clara raised her hand. The room held its breath. "I have a condition," Clara said, her voice clear and unwavering. She turned to Charles, addressing him instead of Henry. "In exchange for this marriage, I want your commitment to help me transform my farm into a resource for the community, a place where those in need can find food, education, and hope." A stunned silence followed. Charles smiled, a glint of pride in his eyes. "Consider it done," he said firmly. The crowd erupted into whispers. Clara's boldness shocked them, and Henry's humiliation was visible in his stiff posture. He glared at Clara, but she met his gaze with calm defiance. "This isn't the time or place for this," Henry hissed through gritted teeth. "It's the perfect time," Clara replied softly, her voice steady. If you want to marry me, you need to understand who I am and what I stand for. Charles, deeply moved, stepped forward and shook Clara's hand. I'll make sure this happens, he said, his voice carrying over the murmurs. Henry, seething, could only stand in silence. The ceremony concluded, but the tension lingered. Guests departed in a flurry of gossip, leaving Henry and Clara alone in their shared quarters for the first time. Henry paced angrily, his frustration spilling over. You've made a fool of me, he snapped, his voice echoing in the room. Do you enjoy embarrassing me in front of my family and friends? Clara, seated by the window, folded her hands in her lap. This marriage was never about your pride, she said calmly. It was about something bigger. If you can't see that, maybe you're the one embarrassing yourself. Her words stung more than Henry cared to admit. That night, unable to sleep, he found a letter on the nightstand with his name scrawled in Clara's neat handwriting. Opening it, he began to read. The letter spoke of her struggles, her dreams, and her unshakable belief in the power of community. It ended with a challenge. Asterisk, you have wealth, but do you have worth? True value comes from what you give, not what you take. Asterisk. For the first time, Henry felt the stirrings of doubt. Alone in the quiet, he began to question the man he had become. The following week, Henry found himself on Clara's farm, surrounded by dirt, sweat, and endless tasks. Charles had insisted that Henry oversee the community farm project as part of the marriage agreement. What Henry hadn't expected was to work alongside Clara herself and her neighbors. On the first day, Henry was handed a shovel and directed to help till the soil. You expect me to do this? He asked, incredulous, his polished loafers sinking into the dirt. Clara, wiping sweat from her brow, handed him a pair of worn gloves. If you want to lead, you have to understand the work, she said simply. The days were grueling. Henry's muscles ached, his manicured hands blistered, and his patience wore thin. But as he toiled in the fields, he began to notice the camaraderie around him. Neighbors worked side by side, sharing laughter and stories despite their struggles. One evening, exhausted and covered in dirt, Henry watched Clara teach a group of children about crop rotation. Her passion and dedication were undeniable. For the first time, he felt a flicker of admiration for her resilience, and a pang of shame for his earlier contempt. As the weeks passed, Henry began to see Clara in a new light. She wasn't just hardworking, she was a leader, a problem solver, and a source of hope for her community. Every day, she inspired others with her vision for the farm, and slowly, Henry found himself wanting to contribute. During a particularly challenging week, a storm destroyed part of the farm's crops. Henry expected Clara to be devastated, but instead she rallied the community, organizing a plan to replant and salvage what they could. What drives you? Henry asked one evening as they sat on the porch, the smell of rain lingering in the air. How do you keep going? Clara glanced at him, her expression thoughtful. I've learned that when you fight for something bigger than yourself, the work feels lighter, even when it's heavy. Her words lingered, planting a seed in Henry's mind. Their conversations grew longer, their silences more comfortable. Henry found himself smiling more, laughing even, as Clara shared stories about the farm's history and her dreams for the future. Somewhere along the way, the chasm between them began to close. Seeing Henry's gradual transformation, Charles decided to join the community farm project. He arrived unannounced one morning, rolling up his sleeves and diving into the work. It was a side of his father Henry had rarely seen, a man willing to get his hands dirty, not just for profit but for purpose. Working side by side, father and son began to rebuild their relationship. As they labored in the fields, Charles shared stories of his humble beginnings. I didn't inherit wealth, Henry. I earned it, every penny. But along the way, I forgot what truly mattered. Don't make the same mistake. The community welcomed Charles warmly, and his contributions transformed the farm into a thriving resource hub. With his financial backing, they built a learning center, expanded the irrigation system, and started a food distribution program for nearby villages. For Henry, seeing his father's humility was eye-opening. It wasn't just about money, it was about using resources to uplift others. Slowly but surely, Henry began to embrace this new way of thinking. By the end of the season, the Sinclair family wasn't just supporting the farm, they were part of its heartbeat, a vital thread in the fabric of the community. 1 year later, the Sinclair farm was unrecognizable. Lush fields stretched into the horizon, the barn was repurposed into a bustling community center, and families gathered to celebrate the farm's grand reopening. The occasion also marked a special milestone: Henry and Clara's vow renewal. This time, the ceremony was held under the open sky, with wooden benches and wildflower bouquets adorning the venue. Clara wore a simple dress she had sewn herself, and Henry, dressed in plain but well-worn clothes, looked every bit the farmer he had become. The guest list was a mix of worlds. Wealthy acquaintances of the Sinclairs mingled with the farmers and villagers who had worked alongside them. It was a testament to the unity Clara had envisioned and worked tirelessly to achieve. When they stood before the crowd, Henry's voice trembled with emotion. "This past year I've learned more about life, love, and purpose than I ever thought possible. Clara, you didn't just save my family's legacy. You saved me." Clara smiled, her eyes shining. "And you've shown me that change is possible, even when it feels like the odds are against us." Their vows, spoken from the heart, were met with applause and tears, marking the beginning of their true partnership. In the months that followed, the Sinclair Community Farm became a model for sustainable development. Henry and Clara worked tirelessly to expand its reach, offering workshops, seed grants, and mentorship programs to struggling farmers. Their efforts brought hope to nearby villages, inspiring others to replicate their success. Charles, moved by the transformation he had witnessed in his son and the community, contributed even more resources to the project. He spearheaded a foundation that channeled the family's wealth into agricultural innovation and education, ensuring that their work would have a lasting impact. Henry's days were no longer filled with empty luxury but with meaningful action. He found joy in the soil under his nails, the laughter of children learning to plant their first crops, and the camaraderie of neighbors working toward a common goal. Clara, always at his side, continued to lead with her unwavering vision. Together they proved that wealth wasn't just a measure of money, it was a tool to create opportunity and change. Their legacy became one of hope, resilience, and generosity, touching countless lives and reshaping what it meant to be truly rich. Years later, Henry sat on the farmhouse porch, his hand resting gently on Clara's. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the fields in hues of gold and amber. Children's laughter echoed in the distance as they ran through the rows of crops, their joy a reminder of all that had been built. Henry looked out over the land, his heart full. "Do you remember the man I was when we first met?" he asked, his voice soft. "I barely recognize him." Clara chuckled, leaning her head on his shoulder. "Do. And I also see the man you've become." He smiled, his eyes glistening. "You were right all along. True wealth isn't about what you have, it's about what you give. I only wish I'd learned that sooner." In the distance, Charles joined the children, guiding them through the fields with the same energy he'd brought to the farm years ago. It was a picture of family, of community, and of purpose. As the stars began to dot the sky, Henry and Clara sat in contented silence, watching a world they had helped transform, a world built on compassion, hard work, and the unshakable power of love.